G'day everybody. Thanks so much for joining in on World Swallowtail Day. Thank you so much to the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust for inviting the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network to be a part of their Saving Swallowtails conference. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Cecil. I'll be talking to you today about the Richmond Birdwing Butterfly. As part of the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network, my role is looking after projects for the organisation. I'm employed by the Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, and we manage the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network, and it's our pleasure to do so. Much of my talk today will be centred about the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network as a community group and what we've done to really drive the recovery of this amazing butterfly species. So we'll get stuck in. I guess before I go too far, I most certainly have to acknowledge all the hard work that's come before me. And Dr. Don Sands, who authored this particular book, really should be credited for his hard work on the Richmond Birdwing Butterfly. And really, without his input for 30 years or more, the Richmond Birdwing Butterfly probably would no longer exist. Not only has Dr. Sands filled that particular book with incredibly detailed scientific information, he's also been behind the actual community-based recovery of the species over 30 years. And whilst at the moment he is spending his time looking at other important butterfly species that need recovery, he must always be recognised for his contribution to saving the Richmond Birdwing Butterfly. This book is most certainly useful, and I've put the reference there for everybody to have a look at. I'm not sure how you might be able to get hold of it, but it is stacked with all the information you need to know about this particular species. Well, kicking off, I guess this is the beautiful Richmond Birdwing Butterfly, Ornithoptera richmondia. The male on the left, the female on the right, of course. This is a really big butterfly, which is not a surprise, I guess. The largest we have here in southeast Queensland. Beautiful to look at, and I think the most striking butterfly in the entire world. Some may argue, but the male, the underside of the male's wings is just striking. The dorsal surface, when it's flying through the sunlight, it just shimmers this beautiful green and sometimes blue colorations, and they're just striking. The female, of course, is very, very beautiful, whilst not being as bright, still quite large and still a lovely, lovely butterfly. And she's much larger with a wingspan up to 160 millimetres, just a big, beautiful butterfly. A little bit of biology, I guess, and I won't go too deeply into it, but just an overview. The Richmond Birdwing Butterfly has 5, possibly 6 instar stages coming out of a little egg that's between 2 to 2.5 millimetres in diameter, quite small. The first instar, of course, eats that egg, gets some nutrition and some energy, and then goes on to feed voraciously on its larval host plant, the Richmond Birdwing Butterfly vine. You can see some beautiful yellow osmetrium on that last or 4th or 5th instar image on the left, on the right, and they're really, really quite a beautiful larvae to go with the adult. Pre-pupa, you can see there in the bottom left-hand side, slinging its little noose to the bottom of a Pravinosa leaf, not long shedding that outer skin and turning into the pupae. And that's, again, a lovely lime green pupae, just as beautiful as the larva, just as beautiful as the adult butterfly. These are really striking. And of course, a female emerging from that pupal skin and hanging out to dry before she flies off. It's really important to talk about the larval host plants of this species as well as the butterfly itself, because without one there isn't the other, and the conservation message is interwoven and importantly linked together. The main species we'll talk about is Parastolochia pravinosa, the birdwing butterfly vine. That's the lowland larval food plant of the Richmond birdwing butterfly. There's a second larval food plant, Parastolochia lahiana, the mountain Aristolochia. We won't talk about that one today because it only grows at elevations above 600 metres, and it really isn't part of our process of the recovery. Those elevated rainforest patches where the mountain Aristolochia grow are still in reasonably good condition. Given mountain Aristolochia won't grow below 600 metres, it's just not something we use as part of the recovery, but it is still there. But Parastolochia pravinosa, or pravinosa as I'll continue to call it from this point on, is a beautiful climbing liane, very important part of the rainforest or subtropical rainforest community. It can be grown to be quite a big vine growing around the stems of plants, has a lovely little flower and gets also a nice yellow fruit pod, which has the seeds inside there. Very, very good to grow, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but this is the most important plant of Richmond Birdwing butterfly's life. I guess the story is very important to tell now, and we'll talk about the drivers of decline of the Richmond Birdwing butterfly. Originally, this species occurred over a probably 400-kilometre plus stretch of subtropical rainforest from Grafton in New South Wales all the way north to probably Maryborough here in Queensland, and that's east of the Great Dividing Range. Sadly, since European arrival from 1870 to the early 1900s, a lot of that subtropical rainforest was cleared for timber, for agriculture, and really what's left now is very isolated and scattered fragments. And that's really even disappearing further through urban expansion. And so as remaining rainforest remnants are really quite rare and very important. We also have the issue of the invasive weed, Dutchman's pipe, Aristolochia elegans, and that's something we'll touch on towards the end of the talk, and is a real blow to the conservation effort of this poor butterfly. But really the main driver of decline for the Richmond Birdwing butterfly has been extensive habitat clearing of that lowland subtropical rainforest. Importantly, the impact of that habitat loss as being severe and large right across its 400+ kilometre range, it's resulted in the absolute reduction of overall population size. What was a connected 400-kilometre functioning population is now just a series of isolated colonies separated by urban landscapes, towns, roads, agriculture, farming, animal production or cropping, roads and forestry. The populations of butterflies remaining within those particular colonies have experienced loss of vigour and fitness, reduced fecundity, decreased egg viability and deformities within life stages, and that's all associated of course with inbreeding depression as a result of having isolated populations of rainforest. That's led to the Richmond Birdwing butterfly and the Pravenosa vine being listed as vulnerable here in Queensland under our Nature Conservation Act. In New South Wales, where the butterfly is also found, it's not listed and doesn't have that same level of protection, and I can't necessarily comment on whether or not it requires protection legislatively because we really only work with the species here in Queensland. Whilst I understand animals and vegetation don't view boundaries the same as we do, we have necessarily restricted our work in Queensland only. I'll put a slide up here which is all about the recovery of the species. Back in 1996, Dr. Sands and Scott created a recovery plan under the guise of CSIRO. Here in Australia, recovery plans are put together by the federal government and implemented mostly to drive the recovery of the species. This particular plan wasn't taken up by any state or federal government. However, it was still most certainly utilised by the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network or Recovery Network as it might have been at the time, as a stepwise process to drive the recovery of the birdwing butterfly, the Richmond Birdwing butterfly. So I'll go through bits and pieces of this now and really tick off where we're at with that. We've worked very hard to develop relationships between the Queensland State Government and the recovery group towards developing a sustainable approach for the Richmond Birdwing butterfly. Sustainable is the big key. There's no point having an approach or a conservation activity that really is not sustainable into the future. So we've worked hard on developing simple things that everybody can get involved in to recover this species. And I'll talk about that mostly in these next sections. Strategies to reduce decline in the abundance of the butterfly. Basically, that's restoring its original distribution via planting and making abundant the larval food plant. If we have lots of food plants, lots of Pravenosa vines growing, then there's plenty of places for female butterflies to lay eggs and the population can expand. There's also been genetic enhancement of core populations, and Dr. Ian Ginther from the Department of Environment Science at Threatened Species Branch will talk to you next about that, and we've worked hand in glove with the Threatened Species Department of the Queensland State Government to help stabilize the genetic populations of core populations to make sure that those butterflies remain strong and healthy. The cultivation and distribution of the larval food plants by community groups has been probably the one thing that has saved this species from extinction or imminent extinction. As I've said, we plant the vines and the butterflies have somewhere to grow. Community groups have got on board across its range and have planted vines en masse, and that has saved this species, and that's terribly important, has been the one thing that has really worked well. Also done a lot of work to identify, document and protect breeding habitats, and that's been about data collection over time to identify where food plants are growing, where food plants have been planted, and where insects can be found. So, reporting, the community being encouraged to report sightings has helped us to develop a database which goes into documenting all this important information. One of the things that we have done less well or are only doing partly at the present time are here in amber and red. Number 4, we really haven't done enough work, in my opinion, on the invasive Dutchman's pipe vine. Briefly, the Dutchman's pipe vine is toxic to the larvae of the Richmond Birdwing butterfly, yet the female Richmond Birdwing is happy to lay her eggs on this particular plant. Once they hatch, the larvae will feed on the leaf and are poisoned. So it's a really terrible plant that we have growing here in Queensland, and it's a double whammy for the poor butterfly. That's something that we need to work on, I think, a lot more in the recovery of this species, and I'll talk about that further on. Number 6, the sustainability of populations in national parks. We haven't done anything in national parks. It's very difficult to plant vines in national parks. It's a permitting process, and there isn't the care and attention to be provided to those vines once they've been planted. So we left national parks to themselves. They're already protected, and we'll leave them to be dealt with by the state government. And we haven't really gone further with the feasibility for captive rearing. Dr. Ginther will talk about captive rearing from the state government and its role in the genetic stabilisation of core populations. But for public display and attention and education, we haven't gone down that path of late. There are permitting, because the species is threatened, there are a lot of permitting hurdles to get over in order to keep the butterflies, and really the state government would rather not do so, which is totally fine by us. We'll just plant the vines. The Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network and its various iterations from the 1990s to the present day have mostly been voluntary committees, paying members, and partly funded, of course, by Wildlife Queensland, who pays my wage to work for the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network. These community-based groups that Dr. Sands has established along the way have really been the driving force for recovering this species. We've been responsible for coordinating projects for the birdwing butterflies, sourcing of funds to get those projects off the ground, and that's often competitive grants, donations and fundraising appeals. We've acted as an information hub to gather information on the species and disseminate that to various people. We're now starting to work on some very strategic projects and develop those. Always along the way, and most importantly, lots of education and awareness workshops, getting out into the community and talking about this species, its recovery requirements, and the necessity to do so have been, again, instrumental in saving this species, along with cultivating that larval food plant. And I must admit, that didn't just happen. A lot of work went into actually working out how best to grow Pravenosa and how best to plant it. Part of that process is most definitely managing a seed bank and collecting seed to distribute to various nurseries for community projects, and we actively send tens of thousands of seeds out to various commercial and community nurseries for planting projects. Most often we'll supply the seed for free and then buy the vines back from the nursery ourselves to plant in projects. And also communications and publications. We put out a newsletter most regularly for our volunteers and members to read. So a very, very active network that has really been core to the recovery of this species over the past 30 years. A big part of what we've done is put out these fact sheets on the Richmond Birdwing butterfly, and they're available to download off the Wildlife Queensland website. The link is at the bottom of those fact sheets. These we take along to community events and hand out en masse to people. They're incredibly detailed with scientific information taken from Dr. Sands' book. and these really tell the important scientific story for people to read. The really most popular fact sheet we hand out is the one in green, the cultivation of the birdwing butterfly vine. This pamphlet gives everybody the information they need to plant and propagate and grow their birdwing butterfly vines. And again, that's been the key to the recovery. Engaging stakeholders is something that's terribly important. You know, we can't do this alone. We need lots of support from the community and from key stakeholders. And we actively work with the Queensland State Government. Threatened Species Department is a good one, but other departments as well, on recovering this species. Our local councils in this area have also been fantastic and have jumped on board to help recover the species and run various projects of their own, completely independent of the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network, which is an absolute plus, and it really means that the recovery network has done its job in educating and engaging these private and local government stakeholders to work on this themselves. And of course, we can't forget the work we've done with education centres, getting children up to speed on the conservation needs and engaged and excited about conserving the Richmond Birdwing butterfly is the future. And I put a little picture up there of the Birdwings Forest School. This is a beautiful little rainforest-based kindergarten where children go to kindergarten in a rainforest gully. They're outdoors all day long. They're within the range of the Richmond Birdwing, and they have wild vines around them, and plenty of butterflies come to visit. And each day, one child gets to plant one birdwing butterfly vine. So they're getting hundreds of vines planted in this particular gully, working very, very hard on recovering the species. They see the butterflies, they plant the vines, and I can't think of a better way to encourage children to get involved in conservation. The network we take responsibility for driving a lot of these projects. We take responsibility for understanding what other players are doing across various jurisdictions, and really making sure that there is some coordination between those various projects, or at least data recovery. And we really work hard on driving the community engagement and awareness. We think making sure the community is involved and aware of what to do and how they can help and are out doing something means we can continue the recovery of this beautiful species. And we will always retain responsibility. If we're not out there making sure this stuff is happening, well, who is? Here are some lovely images of some of the work we've done with the community through workshops and through vine planting programs. We never had a shortage of keen people to attend and who want to come and learn about the species or get involved in planting these vines. And this is some of the best fun you can have standing up, is really talking to people about birdwings and getting vines planted. It's a good time, I guess, to talk about Pravenosa vines. It's not just a simple process to plant a vine and get it in the ground. We're probably looking at 2 years, 18 months to 2 years before a vine is ready to be planted in the ground, from sowing the seeds through to getting them in the ground. We like to have vines that are growing in a 140 ml pot that are 70 plus centimetres tall, with a lovely tendril growing up a bamboo stake. By this time, when they look like that bottom left-hand picture, we know that that root ball is strong and healthy, and we know that the vine itself will tolerate the transplant process. If we plant vines that are younger than 18 months of age, or say the size of that top right picture there, then we understand that the root ball is not as healthy, not as strong, and the vine has a far less successful chance of growing well. It's a bit of a Goldilocks vine, and you can see here in this image, those two vines were planted by the exact same person, and they were watered at the exact same time for weeks to come, and one died and one didn't. The Pravenosa vine has to be planted in an area that's not too wet and is not too dry. It's a rainforest plant, so it has to have some moisture for sure. It's got to have the right light. If it has not enough light, it won't do very well. If it has too much light, it certainly won't do very well. Because it's a rainforest species, it likes to have reasonably rich soil, so we can use some fertiliser. But just like many other Australian natives, it doesn't like too much fertiliser. Getting the right size host tree is terribly important also. It can't be too big or that lovely tendril won't grow around it successfully. If it's too small, well, there is no too small. The soil pH is pretty important. We always, as a rule, add dolomite to our native soil when we're planting, and that really tends to help the pH become a little less acid and helps the plant to grow. There's also some magnesium in that dolomite, which seems to help the vines. And as I said, should be 18 months to 2 years of age. The sad part about that particular vine dying there is, for us here in Australia, and for when we buy these vines from our nursery, that's a $7.50 investment. So putting in, 1,000 vines in a project is really quite a costly undertaking. So we absolutely want to make sure once we plant a vine that it grows healthily and strong and doesn't die. And the big issue we found is follow-up watering. Once we plant these vines, if we don't get any follow-up rain, they most certainly need fortnightly watering post-planting, and then at least monthly watering for the following period of time until they've really got their feet in the ground and are growing well. We experience plenty of periods of drought here in southeast Queensland, so making sure these vines get a good chance of life and get a suitably sized root ball is terribly important. Talking about the data in that recovery plan page, this is what we're looking at. We've got in the blue dots here is wild vines, and the planted vines records are in red. It sort of tells you two pretty important things. One, the contraction of wild vines has been marked. There really should be a lot more blue dots on that map than there are, but unfortunately now a lot of that area is not lowland subtropical rainforest any longer. It also tells you the power of community planting. Each of those planted vines has been put in place by a community member, encouraged by the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network. So there is some really important gains to be made by engaging the community. That map is a little bit old. There should be a lot more red dots on there now, but we haven't got that map up to date. This particular image shows our vines in red, and over the top now in blue is actual insect records. We like to keep records of where people are finding butterflies. The dots represent male butterflies, female butterflies, larvae and pupae, and probably eggs as well. It's no rocket science to see there that where we have vines, we have the butterflies. But importantly, what that's showing there is some gaps. We see a gap in the distribution of the butterfly, which mirrors a gap in planted vines or wild vines. And if we want to make this species expand the population, we need to really think about those particular gaps. And currently now we're working on strategic corridors. From the map previously, you'll see that planted vines have really stabilised core populations across its existing range. It's now important to expand those core populations outwards and get them linked together. So strategic corridors are really what we're working on now as a concerted effort. It's also pretty important to identify what are the most strategic locations, and we do that through looking at our existing data, but also a little bit of desktop mapping and some GIS modelling. And our work has really shown that there's two that we need to think about currently: Sandford to Woodford in the Moreton Bay Regional Council area, and the Tamborine Mountain to Mount Cotton, which is a little bit to the south of Brisbane. We'll talk about the Woodford-Sandford corridor for this example. Woodford and Sandford are both a little bit north of Brisbane, and they follow really what is the Aguilar range. That's about 45 kilometres in distance between those two yellow circles, and you can see that our map data really shows that there is a paucity of planted or wild vines between Sandford and Woodford. We really want to work on this corridor because over 30 years of concentrated effort, there are a lot of planted vines that are established and large and growing well in the western suburbs of Brisbane, and to this day we're still planting vines in the western suburbs of Brisbane. So it's our opinion that if we can get the butterflies in the north to move south via Woodford to Sandford and into the western suburbs of Brisbane, we'll have a self-sustaining population back in Brisbane, which is the absolute key. That's a 45 kilometre space, and it's pretty important to work out how best to plant those vines with limited resource. And so habitat modelling has been very useful to us. We're able to work out based on what conditions the vine likes to grow in, where would be the best places to plant that? So the model contained things like rainfall, soil type, vegetation communities, patch size, and it really came up with this interesting map. We laid that model over the planning cadastre so we could see individual properties, and now we can see where might be the best place to target some of our vine planting projects. We've then worked quite closely with the Moreton Bay Regional Council, which is this highlighted area, to work with them, work with people who are engaged in voluntary conservation agreements or conservation partnerships programs with them, with the local council, to prioritise planting in this area. There's a lot of space in between those coloured in properties that looks like it may not be suitable, but it probably is. That's just the consequence of using a model rather than having a sticky beak yourselves. But we know that we can plant vines in areas that are not necessarily subtropical rainforests or not necessarily suitable, provided the person who's looking after that vine gives it water, gives it fertiliser, gives it dolomite, and gives it a little bit of TLC. We know those vines can grow very, very well. And this is a slow burn. We don't expect to have butterflies moving through this corridor into Western Brisbane within the next year. This is probably a 15 to 20 year project. On the previous slide, you might have seen some butterfly sightings in the actual city of Brisbane, and that does happen. There are vines that have been planted 20 or 30 years ago that are very big, have a lot of biomass and are growing up into trees in people's backyards, and they from time to time have butterflies turn up out of nowhere. It's not a self-sustaining population by any means, but probably individuals that are blown in from the north or the south. Maybe a female lays an egg and we have one hatch. So strange things happen, and if we've got the vines growing, we might see some great success. I did mention the Dutchman's pipe earlier on, and this is really insult to injury. Here we have an introduced invasive vine weed, where studies show that the butterfly prefers to lay her egg on when given a choice between Aristolochia elegans or Parastolochia pravinosa. The female will choose the invasive weed, and the killer is it's poisonous to the birdwing's larvae. Not long after hatching, if the larvae feeds on Dutchman's pipe leaves, it is poisoned quite quickly. And as with most weeds, it grows far more vigorously than Pravinosa, and is in fact probably a key threatening process in the recovery of the Richmond Birdwing butterfly. It's a pretty little plant, excuse me. Big, large pipe, Dutchman's pipe shaped leaves, very pretty, very bright. It has very vigorous growth and large, fleshy, heart-shaped leaves. It takes over really quite badly. And the big part is that seed set. You can see in that middle picture, quite large seed pods, full of seed. Seed distribution probably by 2 vectors, a mechanical with that springy little seed pod. You touch it and those seeds shoot out. Those seeds are also very light, and then probably there's an amount of wind-borne distribution as well. So it has a lot of seed. It distributes that seed very effectively, and it grows very vigorously. It poisons the Richmond Birdwing butterfly larvae. It's a really bad weed that we have growing across the range of the butterfly, and it's something we need to work on. This is a really great picture of a female birdwing butterfly laying eggs on some Dutchman's pipe vine in the back of the Gold Coast hinterland. It's a fantastic story. This particular image was taken on what is SEQ Waterland. That's our water provider here in southeast Queensland. And SEQ Water understood the issue here, got on board very, very quickly, contacted the department. They were able to rescue some of these, some of the eggs that were laid, larvae that were laid, transport them to Dr. Ginther's captive rearing facilities and save some particular species, save some individual butterflies from dying. Excuse me. But importantly, SEQ Water started a process of ripping that weed out and planting Pravinosa instead. So hats off to SEQ Water, and they deserve big rewards for their hard work. Sadly, eradication of this particular vine is very, very difficult. I'm not sure what weeds are like in the UK or around the world, but here in Australia, weed management is very difficult and very costly. So we're unlikely to be able to eradicate this weed from across the birdwings range. We will try. We really need to think about where infestations are in relation to our corridors and to our planting projects. If we're going to plant vines or encourage corridors, then we need to be actively working on getting rid of that invasive Dutchman's pipe weed at the same time. And it's something that I flagged earlier on. We don't do well, we don't do enough of it, and it's really an area that we can work on much better into the future. Well, thanks very much for listening. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network or the butterfly itself, you can have a look at the Richmond Birdwing site on the Wildlife Queensland webpage. You're welcome to join the RBCN and be kept abreast of what's going on via our beautiful newsletters. And there is also a Facebook group that you could tag along to. It's a really great group. There's no rubbish on there, just lots of pictures of people's birdwing vines and birdwing butterflies at various life stages throughout the year. And I encourage you all to have a quick look at that, because if you want to see pictures of the birdwing butterfly or the larvae or the eggs or the vines, that Facebook group is the place to go to. There's a lot of people to thank for bringing this to you today. Obviously, the Swallowtail and Birdwing Trust, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be talking to you here today, when they've been fantastic and supportive. A lot of photographic contributors to this presentation that I haven't mentioned, but all of you out there, if you recognise your photo there, thank you very much for allowing me to use it. Some local councils, the nurseries that grow the vines for us, Pro Plants, and Noosa and District Land Care, and of course the Richmond Birdwing Conservation Network Committee and the Department of Environment and Science. I hope you've enjoyed that particular talk here today. Please enjoy the rest of the Saving Swallowtails Conference. I'm sure there'll be some incredibly informative talks to come, and I hope you enjoy your day. Thanks very much.